The giant on stage did not know what he had just done. The 23,000 fans packed into Madison Square Garden did not know. The 3 ringside commentators sitting behind their broadcast table did not know. The camera operators, the backstage crew, the promoters watching from the production truck. None of them knew. The only people in that entire arena who understood what was about to happen were the 4 men standing close enough to see the stillness in the eyes of the small figure who had just been pulled from his seat in the front row. Not stillness born of fear. Stillness born of the complete absence of it. The man they had just grabbed weighed 135 pounds. He was wearing a plain black shirt and dark slacks. He had no championship belt, no entrance music, no manager, no corner team. He had a cup of soda in his hand when they grabbed him, and he had set it down carefully on the armrest before standing up. Carefully. That detail matters. In the next 4 seconds, the most physically dominant professional wrestler in the history of North American sports entertainment, a man who stood 7 feet tall, weighed over 500 pounds, had never been body slammed, had never been knocked from his feet by another human being in 11 years of performing, would discover something that no championship belt, no undefeated streak, no amount of size or strength or reputation had ever prepared him to understand. He had grabbed the wrong man. It happened on the night of August 6, 1976. This is the story that was never supposed to leave that building. New York City. Madison Square Garden. Friday night, the 6th of August, 1976. The arena was sold out. Every seat filled, every aisle packed, every standing room position claimed by bodies pressed together in the August heat. The air conditioning was struggling. The smell was cigarette smoke, popcorn, and something electric. The particular voltage that fills a room when people have been waiting for something to happen and sense, collectively, that it is finally about to. This was the World Wrestling Federation's Summer Spectacular, not the biggest card of the year, but close. 7 matches on the card. Grudge matches, title matches, a battle royal that had been hyped for 6 weeks on television. 23,000 people who had paid anywhere from $4 in the upper deck to $22 in the front rows. And every single one of them had come for the same reason. They had come to see Andre. Andre the Giant was the main event. He was always the main event. He had been the main event every single time he had walked into any building anywhere in the world for the past 11 years, because there was simply no logical reason to put anything after Andre the Giant. You didn't follow Andre. Nothing followed Andre. He was the last image you wanted burned into the minds of the people who paid to be there, because it was the image that made them buy a ticket for the next show. In 1976, Andrei René Roussimoff was 30 years old and at the absolute peak of whatever category of human being he occupied. He stood 7 feet 4 inches tall in his wrestling boots. His walking weight fluctuated between 480 and 520 pounds depending on the month, the city, and how recently he had eaten. His hands were documented by the people who shook them, by the photographers who captured them next to normal objects for scale, as being so large that a standard adult human head fit inside them the way a baseball fits inside a catcher's mitt. His reach, from fingertip to fingertip with his arms extended, was 8 feet, 2 inches. His chest measured 62 inches around. These are not promotional numbers invented by a publicist. These are measurements taken by tailors, by doctors, by the people responsible for keeping him alive and functioning in a world that had not been built to accommodate him. His condition, acromegaly, the uncontrolled production of growth hormone by a benign tumor on his pituitary gland, had been transforming him since childhood, slowly and relentlessly, adding mass and height in ways that medical science could observe but not stop. By 1976, it had been working on him for over 2 decades, and the result was something that human language had not developed adequate vocabulary to describe. In 11 years of professional wrestling across 4 continents, Andre the Giant had never been body slammed. This was not a storyline. It was not a promotional fiction invented to protect his drawing power, though it certainly served that purpose. It was simply true. No one had been able to do it. The mechanics of the problem were straightforward. To body slam a man, you must first lift him. To lift him, you must get under his center of gravity, which means getting low, which means getting physically close to a man who weighs over 500 pounds and does not want you close to him. Every wrestler who had attempted it had failed at that first stage. They couldn't get position, he wouldn't allow it. He used his size the way a great chess player uses board control, not with aggression but with presence. He simply occupied space in a way that made certain things geometrically impossible for anyone trying to attack him. The list of men who had tried and failed to slam Andre was a roster of the most physically gifted athletes in the history of the sport. Men who could press 400 pounds overhead. Men who had spent their entire careers building bodies specifically designed to do things that normal human bodies could not do. None of them had managed it. The slam had become mythology. A thing that couldn't happen. A law of nature, like the speed of light or the boiling point of water. You simply accepted it as a fixed fact of the universe and organized your understanding of wrestling around it. Tonight, Andre was scheduled to defend his undefeated status against a rotating series of challengers in what had been billed as an open invitational. 3 opponents, each given 5 minutes to become the first man in history to body slam Andre the Giant. If any of the 3 succeeded, they would receive a check for $10,000, a number that had been announced on television for 6 consecutive weeks and had burned itself into the imagination of every man in the building. $10,000. In 1976, that was close to the median annual household income in the United States. Large enough to dream about, small enough to try for. The first 2 challengers had already failed. They had come prepared, trained specifically for this moment, studied Andre on film, developed strategies. Both had been removed from the ring in under 3 minutes. Not hurt, not humiliated dramatically, simply unable to find a path through the problem that Andre presented. He hadn't even breathed hard. He stood in the center of the ring between attempts, arms folded across his enormous chest, completely unbothered. The way a mountain is unbothered by a change in weather. The 3rd challenger had not yet been announced. The promotion had built a mystique around the 3rd slot. Names had been floated for weeks. Former champions, Olympic weightlifters, a professional football player from the New York Jets who had reportedly agreed and then withdrawn. A withdrawal with enough drama to suggest it had been staged, but enough ambiguity to make people wonder. What happened next was not staged. The ring announcer, a man in a white tuxedo jacket who had been doing this job at Madison Square Garden for 6 years and had developed a professional immunity to surprise, stepped to the center of the ring, raised his microphone, and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, the World Wrestling Federation is proud to announce that the 3rd and final challenger of the evening. He paused here. A theatrical pause. The kind of pause that announcer had deployed 1,000 times in front of crowds ranging from 200 people in a junior high school gymnasium to this, 23,000 people in the most famous arena in the world. Will be chosen from among you. From this audience. Tonight, one person in this building will have the opportunity to make history. Andre the Giant has agreed. And here the announcer's voice took on a tone that communicated both the gravity and the absurdity of what he was about to say. Andre the Giant has agreed to face any person in this audience who believes they can body slam the largest man in the history of this sport. The crowd's reaction was immediate and enormous. Not applause exactly. Something larger than applause. The sound that 23,000 people make when they are simultaneously excited, disbelieving, calculating, and beginning to imagine themselves as part of the story. Andre unfolded his arms. He turned slowly, performing the scan of the audience with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been the biggest thing in every room he has ever entered, and expects this room to be no different. He was looking for something. Possibly someone large, possibly someone who looked like they might be foolish enough to try and entertaining enough to fail, interestingly. His gaze stopped. In the 3rd row of the floor section, directly in front of the hard camera position, there was a man sitting with a stillness that was different from the stillness of everyone around him. The people on either side of him were leaning forward, craning their necks, murmuring to each other with the agitated energy of people who had just been told that something extraordinary was possible. This man was doing none of that. He was sitting back. His posture was relaxed but not lazy. There is a difference, and it is visible to anyone who knows how to look. He was watching Andre with the focused, analytical attention of someone who was not watching a show. He was watching a problem. He was watching a body. He was watching the way Andre moved, the way he shifted his weight, the way his feet were positioned, the way his balance distributed across the enormous architecture of his frame. This was not the watching of a fan. It was the watching of someone who was, at that moment, solving something. Andre pointed. His finger, which was roughly the size of a normal man's forearm, extended toward the 3rd row. You, the small one, the one in black. Come here. A few people nearby laughed. Some looked at the small man with the particular sympathy that crowds extend to individuals who are about to be embarrassed. The small man did not react to the laughter. He did not look around to see who was laughing. He simply looked at Andre's pointing finger, then at the ring, then at the distance between his seat and the ring, making the calculation in a way that was visible but private. A purely internal assessment with no performance attached to it. Then he nodded once. A small, precise nod. The nod of a man accepting a reasonable request. The man sitting next to him, a compact, intense individual who had the particular physical awareness of someone trained in combat arts, grabbed his arm. His voice was low and urgent. The small man looked at him. Something passed between them that required no words on the small man's part. He placed his hand over his companion's hand and gently, without force or drama, removed it from his arm. He said something. 3 words, maybe 4. Then he stood up. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 35 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed 135 pounds. He was the most dangerous human being on the planet. And the 23,000 people in Madison Square Garden, along with the 7-foot 500-pound man pointing at him from inside the ring, had absolutely no idea. In August of 1976, Bruce Lee was not yet a legend in the way that legends are usually constructed. He was something stranger and more specific than that. He was a fact that had not yet been fully processed by the world that contained him. He had made 4 films in Hong Kong between 1971 and 1973 that had broken box office records across Asia with a thoroughness that the entertainment industry still struggled to explain. He had given demonstrations at martial arts tournaments up and down the West Coast throughout the 1960s that people who had been present still talked about in the specific way that witnesses talk about things they saw with their own eyes, but know will not be fully believed by anyone who wasn't there. He had built a personal system of combat philosophy that rejected every assumption that every martial art before it had treated as foundational and demonstrated its products on enough bodies, in enough rooms, in front of enough witnesses that the demonstrations had developed a reputation that traveled faster than the man himself. But in August of 1976, he had been dead for 3 years. He had died on July 20th, 1973, in Hong Kong at the age of 32. He was pronounced dead at 11:30 p.m., 11 days away from the worldwide release of Enter the Dragon, the film that would make him the most famous martial artist in the history of the world, a distinction that would arrive for him posthumously. The death of Bruce Lee in 1973 is historical fact. What has been in dispute among a specific and serious community of martial arts historians and investigators for 4 decades is the timeline of certain events, the question of which demonstrations, which confrontations, which encounters passed from person to person through the oral tradition of the martial arts world actually occurred when the official record says they occurred. This story is set in 1976. Bruce Lee died in 1973. These 2 facts create a problem that this story will not resolve for you because the people who were present that night have never agreed on its resolution. What is agreed upon, by every person who was present, by every account gathered from witnesses in the years and decades that followed, is what happened. Not when. What. And what happened is what this story is about. Bruce Lee walked to the ring the way he always moved through space, without urgency and without hesitation, which sounds like the same thing but is not. Urgency and hesitation are both responses to pressure. Bruce moved as though pressure were a concept that applied to other situations, in other rooms, to other people. He moved through the aisle with his hands loose at his sides, his eyes tracking the ring ahead of him with the calm, specific attention of a man approaching something he has already, in every meaningful sense, arrived at. People reached out from their seats as he passed. Some of them recognized him. The films had reached American audiences, particularly on the coasts, and his face was not unknown to the people sitting in the expensive seats at a New York sporting event in 1976. Most of them didn't. Most simply reached out the way crowds reach out toward anyone moving toward something dangerous. The instinctive physical expression of excitement and proximity, and the vague wish to be connected to whatever was about to happen. Bruce acknowledged none of it. Not dismissively, not with the performance of ignoring that is its own kind of attention. He simply had his focus somewhere else, and his focus, when it was somewhere, was entirely there. He reached the ring apron and moved under the bottom rope in a single fluid motion that several people sitting close enough to observe it would later describe with a specificity that suggested it had imprinted on them. Not climbing in, not rolling in, moving in, the way liquid moves through an opening, with no part of the movement wasted, and no moment where the motion stopped and considered itself before continuing. He stood up inside the ring. Andre the Giant looked down at him. The contrast was almost cartoonish. Andre at 7 feet 4 and over 500 pounds, Bruce at 5 feet 7 and 135. These were not numbers on a promotional graphic. They were 2 bodies standing 8 feet apart in a 20-foot ring under lights bright enough to read by. And the math of what people were seeing was doing something complicated in the part of the brain that processes physical threat and physical possibility simultaneously. Andre looked at Bruce for a long moment, long enough that the people watching could see that he was looking, that something in what he saw was registering in a way that the previous 2 challengers had not prompted. The previous challengers had been large, serious, prepared men, and Andre had managed them with the unhurried competence of a man dealing with problems well within the range of what he had solved before. This was different. This was different, and Andre knew it was different because something changed in his expression in the moment he looked at Bruce that had not been present when he looked at the other two men. It was not concern. It was not the tightening of fear. It was something more subtle and more interesting than that. It was recognition, not of the person. Andre did not know who Bruce Lee was, had not seen his films, had not heard his name spoken in any context that had registered, but of a quality. The quality of stillness that Bruce carried into the ring with him. The quality of absolute self-possession. Andre had been in rings with thousands of men across 11 years and 4 continents. He knew what fear felt like in a body. Knew what bravado looked like. Knew what genuine confidence looked like. And knew. Because you develop this capacity when enough people have tried enough things against you in enough settings. The difference between confidence that comes from not having yet encountered your limits and confidence that comes from having encountered them and moved past them. The man standing in his ring was the second kind. Andre did not articulate this. He wouldn't have been able to. He simply looked at Bruce Lee a moment longer than he had looked at either of the other two men, and then did something no one in Madison Square Garden had ever seen him do at the beginning of a segment like this. He uncrossed his arms. He let them hang at his sides. He adjusted his feet slightly. He was not taking a fighting stance. Andre the Giant did not have a fighting stance in the traditional sense. He was the fighting stance. His size and reach and mass were the strategy, and postures built around the assumption of mutual vulnerability had never applied to him. But he was adjusting, calibrating, treating the situation with an attention he had not brought to the earlier challengers. He reached out one enormous hand toward Bruce, not aggressively, not to grab, but in the manner of an introduction. The enormous professional courtesy of a man who had enough self-awareness to know that the gap between himself and most opponents was too large for the normal social rituals to function without acknowledgement. "What is your name, friend?" His voice was accented. French, from his years in Paris before his career took him to North America, softened by a decade of English but still distinctively his own. Bruce looked at the hand, looked up at the face that was, from his vantage, nearly 2 feet above his own. He shook it. His handshake was notable. Firm and direct, with a quality that more than one witness would later describe using the same word. Intentional, like the grip of a man who was communicating something precise through the contact. "Bruce Lee," he said. The name meant nothing to Andre. What it meant to him was purely what he could observe. A man standing in front of him roughly the size of many of the 12-year-old children who asked for his autograph in hotel lobbies, who had walked to this ring with the certainty of someone who had a plan, and who had just shaken his hand in a way that Andre, who had shaken more hands than he could count and had learned to read them the way some people read faces, found genuinely interesting. "You practice wrestling?" he asked. "Something like that," said Bruce. Andre nodded slowly. The crowd, which had been maintaining a particular quality of noise, loud but shapeless, the sound of people processing a situation they didn't yet have a framework for, shifted into a different register. Quieter and more focused. The way a crowd quiets when it realizes that what it is watching is not going to fit any of the categories it brought to the building with it. A referee materialized at the edge of the ring, looked at both of them, looked at the clock on the scoreboard, which showed 5 minutes, held up his hand. 5 minutes, he said. 1 fall. Standard rules apply. Body slam counts. He looked at Andre. He looked at Bruce. He stepped back. Andre settled his weight across his feet, the enormous shifting of mass that wrestlers who had faced him described as something you could feel in the canvas beneath you, a redistribution of gravitational force that changed the physical environment of the ring. He raised his arms slightly, not into a grappling stance exactly, but the preparatory position of a man who has spent 11 years developing a specific physical vocabulary for controlling space and is about to apply it. Bruce stood where he was, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at his sides. Not a fighting stance, not a defensive position, not any posture that the combat sports world would have recognized as preparation. He looked like a man waiting for a train. 4 seconds later, the building would never be the same. The referee's hand dropped. Andre moved. When people who were present that night are asked to describe what happened in the next 4 seconds, they consistently reach for the same problem. Language was built for things that happen at human speed, and what occurred in that ring happened at a speed that language has to approximate rather than capture. So here is the approximation. Andre the Giant, 500 pounds of trained mass moving with the deceptive velocity that very large things achieve when they commit fully to direction, came forward, not charging, Andre never charged. Charging implies loss of control, and everything Andre did in a ring was controlled, deliberate, the application of physics in the service of a specific outcome. He came forward the way a tide comes forward, with the absolute certainty of something that has mass and momentum on its side, and has never in 11 years encountered a reason to doubt that those two things were sufficient. His hands reached out. Enormous hands, each one capable of encircling a normal human skull, moving toward Bruce's shoulders with the practiced efficiency of a man who had opened 10,000 physical confrontations this way and found the formula reliable enough to trust without variation. His hands never arrived. What happened in the space between Andre's reaching and the place where his hands expected to find resistance was the thing that 23,000 people spent the next 4 seconds, and then the next 4 decades, trying to understand. Bruce moved. Not away, not backward, not to the side, not in any of the directions that the geometry of the situation suggested were available options for a 135-pound man confronted with 500 pounds of forward momentum. He moved forward, into Andre. Into the space that Andre's movement was creating and simultaneously occupying, into the gap between intention and arrival that exists in every physical action taken by every body in the world. The tiny temporal window between when a movement begins and when it completes itself, a window that is, for most bodies in most situations, too small to be functionally useful. Bruce Lee had spent 20 years making it large enough to walk through. His left hand came up, not to block. Blocking is a reaction, and reactions operate on a different timeline than what Bruce was doing. It came up to redirect. The distinction is everything. Blocking meets force with force, and depends on the relative magnitude of the forces involved, which meant that any blocking strategy against Andre the Giant had already lost before it began. Redirecting meets force with geometry. It takes the line of an incoming force and bends it, uses the momentum of the thing moving toward you as a resource rather than a threat. Bruce's left hand found Andre's right forearm, the place where the arm's direction is most legible, and applied to it a pressure that was not large but was precisely placed and precisely timed, introducing a small curve into the straight line Andre's arm had been traveling along. Andre's arm, following the altered geometry, described an arc that took it past Bruce's left shoulder instead of onto it. Andre's left hand, following the same forward commitment, completed its reach into empty space. For a fraction of a second, Andre the Giant's hands were both in the air, both committed to a grasp that had not found purchase, and his body, 500 pounds of it, moving forward with the confidence of 11 years, was in the precise mechanical condition that Bruce Lee had been waiting for. Both hands extended and empty. Weight forward. The enormous architecture of his frame tilted fractionally, no more than a degree or two, across the boundary between balanced and committed. In that fraction of a second, Bruce was already somewhere else. He was inside Andre's reach, inside the space that Andre's size normally made inaccessible to anyone trying to get close enough to attempt a slam, the space that had protected Andre for 11 years as reliably as any defense, because the defense was not a technique but a dimension. You could not get inside Andre's reach without going through Andre, and going through Andre was not a thing that human bodies of normal dimensions could accomplish without his cooperation. Bruce had gone through the gap between where Andre's arms were reaching and where Andre's body was. A gap that existed for approximately 4/10 of a second, while Andre's commitment to the forward grasp was complete, and his ability to adjust was temporarily suspended. 4/10 of a second. Bruce Lee had trained for 20 years to do specific things in 4/10 of a second. He was inside, his right shoulder against Andre's left side, his center of gravity positioned in a relationship to Andre's center of gravity that the physics of two bodies in contact describe with the kind of clarity that has no exceptions. His knees bent, not deeply, but in the precise degree of flexion required to align his skeletal structure along the most efficient path for the transfer of force from the ground, through his legs, through his hips, through his back, through his arms into the body he intended to move. Bruce Lee did not lift with his arms. The arms are the last link in the chain. The chain starts at the ground. Power originates in the legs, travels through the hips, is directed by the back, and arrives at the point of contact through the arms, which are simply the delivery mechanism for something generated elsewhere. He pushed against the floor. Every joint, every muscle, every tendon in his body aligned in a single direction for a single moment with the totality of coordination that 20 years of dedicated practice had made possible. Andre the Giant left the ground. This is the moment that the accounts always struggle with. Not because the witnesses doubt what they saw. The consistency across dozens of independent accounts gathered over decades is remarkable. But because what they saw was, by any reasonable prior expectation, not possible. A 135-pound man had lifted a 500-pound man off the ground. The mathematics of this are not ambiguous. The physics are not mysterious. What Bruce had done was not magic or illusion. What he had done was apply every available unit of force his body could produce with such complete efficiency, such total absence of wasted movement, that the result exceeded what people expected from a body of his size because people's expectations were calibrated to bodies that produced force with ordinary efficiency. Bruce Lee's body did not produce force with ordinary efficiency. It produced force the way a precisely engineered machine produces it, with every component performing its specific function at the precise moment required, with nothing lost to friction or misalignment, or the hesitation that accompanies uncertainty. Andre went up, not high. This was not the dramatic arc of a scripted moment designed for maximum visual impact. He went up the way a heavy object goes up when something underneath it has done the mechanical work required to break its contact with the ground, with a solidity and a reality and a total absence of showmanship that made it, paradoxically, more impressive than any staged version of the same event could have been. He went up and then he came down. He landed on the canvas with a sound that the ringside reporters would spend the following week trying to find words for. One of them settled on the word final. Not loud, not dramatic. Final. The sound of something that had been one way for 11 years becoming, in a single instant, permanently different. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Madison Square Garden made a noise that none of the 23,000 people there could individually recall contributing to, because it was not made of individual voices deciding to make it. It was made of 23,000 nervous systems simultaneously processing the same impossible information, and responding with the only mechanism available when the brain encounters something it has no existing category for. The noise was not celebration. It was not the roar of a crowd watching a favorite succeed or a villain fail. It was something prior to those things, something more fundamental. It was the sound of a collective understanding being revised at speed, of 23,000 people feeling the floor of their assumptions about what was physically possible give way beneath them, and finding in the fraction of a second before a new floor materialized, something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration, and the particular electric joy of witnessing a thing that you know, in the moment of witnessing it, that you will spend the rest of your life trying to describe to people who were not there. Andre lay on the canvas for a moment, not hurt. The fall had been managed by a man who had spent 11 years learning how to fall safely, and his body knew what to do even when his mind was still catching up with what had happened. He lay there looking at the lights above the ring, and his face in that moment was described by every person who could see it as something they did not expect to see on the face of Andre the Giant. Not anger, not embarrassment, not the wounded pride of a man whose myth has been punctured in public. What they saw was wonder. The open, unguarded wonder of a man who has just discovered that the world contains something he did not know it contained, and who is, in the first moment of that discovery, before the ego has had time to reinterpret the experience in terms easier to live with, simply and completely astonished. Bruce stepped back. He did not stand over Andre. He did not raise his hands. He did not perform the moment for the crowd that was now producing a sound that had no ceiling. He simply stepped back to a neutral position and waited. The way he always waited, with the stillness that was not the absence of something, but the presence of a quality that most people spend their entire lives without developing. The quality of being completely in a moment, without needing the moment to be anything other than what it is. Andre sat up. He sat up slowly, and then stood. And the standing of Andre the Giant from the canvas was itself an event, the sheer physical spectacle of that mass rising and reorganizing itself into verticality. And the crowd responded with a fresh wave of sound. He turned. He looked at Bruce, the ring announcer, who had retreated to a corner and was now gripping the top rope with both hands with the unconscious grip of a man who needs something solid to hold on to, found his microphone and his voice simultaneously. "Ladies and gentlemen, your winner." He looked at Bruce. At the man who had walked down from the third row in dark slacks and a plain black shirt and done the thing that 11 years had established as the thing that could not be done. Bruce Lee. The crowd did not receive this the way crowds receive announced results. It received it the way a room receives a name it has been waiting to hear without knowing it was waiting, with a recognition that felt less like learning something new and more like having something confirmed. Andre walked across the ring with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. He stopped in front of Bruce. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the particular accented English that everyone who knew him could reproduce from memory, "How?" One word. Not a full question, just the first syllable of the only question that mattered. Bruce looked up at him. At the face of a man who had been the largest and most dominant physical presence in every room he had ever entered, looking down with an expression that had nothing left in it of hierarchy or assumption. Just the question. How? It is not about size. Bruce said. His voice was quiet enough that only the people in the ring and the first 2 rows could hear it. But the quiet carried with a precision and completeness that means nothing is lost even at low volume. It is not about strength. Those are the things you can see. What you cannot see is structure, alignment, the path that force travels through a body when the body is organized correctly. He paused. Andre waited. "You are strong," said Bruce. "You are the strongest man I have ever stood next to. But strength without structure is like water without a riverbank. It is powerful and it goes nowhere specific." Andre was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not the nod of a man conceding a point in an argument. The nod of a man receiving something he had not known he needed, accepting it with the particular grace of someone large enough in character to match their size in body. Andre held out his hand. Bruce took it. The handshake lasted several seconds. Around them, Madison Square Garden continued to produce the sound of 23,000 people revising their understanding of what was possible, and neither man paid it any attention because what was happening between them required all of the attention both of them had. In the car on the way back to the hotel, the man who had been sitting next to Bruce in the 3rd row sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at New York moving past and said nothing for a long time. Bruce drove. The city was loud outside and quiet inside. Finally, the man said, "You know they are all going to talk about this. Everyone in that building. For years." Bruce kept his eyes on the road. "Good," he said. The man looked at him. "That is good?" Bruce was quiet for a moment. Then, "When people talk about what they cannot explain, they are asking a question." He changed lanes. "The question is more important than the answer." The man thought about this. Then he said, "And what is the question?" Bruce almost smiled. "The question," he said, "is always the same." He signaled, turned, moved the car through the intersection with the same unhurried precision with which he moved through everything. "The question is, what else do I not know?" They drove in silence after that. Behind them, in Madison Square Garden, 23,000 people were still talking. They would talk tomorrow. They would talk for the rest of that year, and the year after, and the decades after that, passing the story from person to person the way important stories are passed, each retelling adding something and losing something and changing something, but always returning to the same center, the same fixed point around which everything else orbited. The moment when a 135-pound man in a plain black shirt stepped into a ring with the largest human being in the history of professional wrestling, and in 4 seconds changed what the word possible meant. Not because he was stronger, not because he was larger, but because he had spent every available hour of a human life learning to understand, with a depth and a completeness that most people never approach in anything, the difference between force and structure, between power and precision, between what a body can do when it trusts what it knows. He had picked the wrong man. Now the whole world would know it.